Billy Beane is a manager at the Oakland Athletics that took part in the American Baseball League. In the 2001 season, Beane had to swallow a bitter pill because his team was defeated by New York Yankees. The defeat was not that surprising, considering Athletics was a small underdog team with limited financial support while Yankees was a rich team full of star players. Even though he had predicted the loss, the defeat was still hard to accept because he expected more from his team. After that defeat, Beane had to lose 3 players of his team in the next season who moved after being recruited by another club. The move of his main players made his team's performance even more concerning. Beane then discussed the crisis with the owner of the club to improve the team's performance by asking for additional funds to recruit new star players to replace the players who had left. The argument between the two of them could not be avoided because on one hand, Beane asked to be given freedom and additional funds to improve his team, but on the other hand, the owner asked Beane not to over-budget the club's finance, considering that Athletics was not a wealthy club. Feeling that his effort to ask for funding didn't work, Beane started to find a replacement for his flagship player by himself, and in the process, Beane was repeatedly rejected when he was trying to recruit his target player, and after his last recruitment attempt failed, Beane met a player analyst named Peter Brand. When most analysts judge players by their abilities on the field, Peter judged them by the numbers he gets from complicated calculations based on the statistics of the players. Beane initially questioned the strange method that Brand used to judge the players they scouted, but after a depth explanation, Beane finally understood the logic and decided to recruit him as the team's advisor. Shortly after, Beane and Peter started looking for 3 new, cheap players to match his team's mediocre funds. Peter explained his strange but worth-trying vision. Peter mentioned some benched players that were rarely used by their respected teams, starting from those with bad pitching skills, players with a slow pace, to old players. No team was willing to recruit the players that Peter was targeting, but behind all that, Peter was convinced that these bad players could become star players as long as the team could understand their true potential, and because he believed in Peter's analysis, Beane finally agreed and was ready to submit their ideas to the other club officials. As predicted, the officials wouldn't agree with their ideas and were irritated because the two of them wanted to bring in bad players when the team's performance was declining. Moreover, they also thought that Peter's analysis, which was based solely on numbers, was unclear nonsense. Amid the heated situation, Beane explained that Athletics needed a new strategy if they wanted to get up and perform brilliantly in the next season because it's no longer possible to use the same strategy. Since Beane was the leading manager of the club, everyone couldn't forbid what he wanted to do and was forced to carry out the plan. Finally, Beane started negotiating with the new players based on the list that had been made by Peter. Amidst their busy schedule, Beane still had time to spend with his daughter, who turned out to be very good at singing. His daughter's singing helped him through his stress and motivated him to work even harder. Back then, Beane used to be an outstanding student who got a scholarship at a top university, but one day, Beane got an offer from an agent for a big baseball club after they saw Beane's impeccable talent at a baseball match at his school. The agent promised him a bright future in the club and made him tempted to join the club and abandon his scholarship at that time to focus on a career. After going through careful and full consideration, Beane finally decided to accept the offer to become a baseball player in their club, and finally, Beane left the scholarship to study at a famous university. Unfortunately, once he entered the real league match, the reality hit him hard. Beane's performance was not as good as expected because the real league match was very much different from the match at his old school. Finally, after his performance continued to decline, Beane was disappointed. All the sweet things that his agent promised to him were not even close to the reality that he had. He regretted ever leaving his study and turned down the scholarship offer to play at the club. He only managed to graduate from high school. He decided to retire and find a better job, but since he was just a high school graduate, he couldn't find a better job and decided to choose a career in the world of baseball from behind the scenes. One day, Beane was invited to have a one-on-one conversation with the head of talent scout named Grady. Grady harshly criticized the strategy that Beane and Peter were carrying out because, in his eyes, baseball is not just about numbers or science, but the ability and experience on the field. This made Grady pessimistic. He thought that Beane's strategy would only make the team's condition worse, but Beane still insisted that the strategy was the most effective way to save Athletics. The argument went on to the point they started bringing up the past and offended personal matters. Turned out, Grady was the agent that recruited him to the club back then and convinced him to turn down his scholarship. Beane was fed up and decided to fire Grady at that very moment. In the 2002 season, Athletics began the season by training and introducing their new players to the media. Beane recruited 3 players: the pitcher with a strange pitching style, Chad Bradford, the 34-year-old David Justice and Scott Hatteberg were happy, a player that suffered from permanent abnormalities in his hands. The presence of these three problematic players started to cause conflict between Beane and the head coach, Art Howe. After going through various arguments and dramas, Athletics was finally ready for their first match. Every time his team was about to play, Beane had a strange habit. He would never show up during the match and was afraid to watch it in person. Since his failure to become a baseball player, Beane had the trauma to watch any baseball match in person. He could only anxiously wait for the results of the match somewhere else. Not only that, but Beane was also known to always keep his distance from his players so he wouldn't hesitate to fire or sell them when the time comes. When the match started, the result was according to many people's predictions. It seemed that Athletics' performance was still in shambles, despite Beane and Peter having strengthened the team with their new strategy. At the same time, Beane and Howe often got into arguments to decide which player to play. Beane told Howe to play Happy, but Howe instead chose a player to his liking. He emphasized that even though Beane is the manager, he never liked it when Beane intervened in his authority as head coach. Things got heated when the media speculated that the reason why Athletics performed badly was thanks to Beane and Peter's strategy, which was based solely on the formulation of the numbers that the media named as Moneyball strategy. Over time, Athletics continued to suffer from defeats and was at the bottom of the standings. Several parties finally blamed Beane for Athletics' poor performance. Even worse, voices have begun to appear demanding that Beane be immediately removed. Amid this commotion, Beane and Peter were still calm because they both believed that currently, Athletics was on the right track and it was only a matter of time until they performed optimally. They were both sure that their strategy would work. Beane also asked his daughter not to worry about him because of the many oblique news that badmouthed him. However, despite his calm demeanor, Beane was frustrated to see his new strategy never came to fruition. Even Beane was so angry that he often rampaged at the team's locker room. In these difficult times, Peter reminded him not to act in anger because it would only hurt himself and the team, but Beane was still annoyed because the strategy didn't go smoothly since Howe didn't want to play the players that Beane had recruited. He then planned to fire Howe's favorite players so that the position would be vacant and Howe would have no other choice but to play the new players. As soon as Howe found out about Beane's plan, Howe immediately against it, saying that the plan would end the club, but even so, Beane still threatened to fire Howe's favorite players if he refused to play his strategy. After that, Peter began to make strategies for the upcoming matches and Beane started to change. He started to intervene directly and motivated the team they coached to build the team's winning mentality. Since then, Athletics' performance started to get better and climbed up the league standings. They even recorded a 7-win streak at that time. That made many parties wonder about the reason behind their immediate advancement in the league. Sometime later, Beane planned to recruit a star player. He did many things to help with the plan, from offering reasonable prices to gaslighting other clubs to not recruiting the player that he targeted. Finally, Beane's trick was successful and now Athletics has a better chance to win a championship title. Athletics' winning trend continued. So far, they have made 16 consecutive wins. Analysts were surprised by the increasingly unstoppable performance. They also had no idea since the Moneyball strategy that Beane used was once doubted by many parties. The method was originally considered to deviate from the usual baseball game strategy. This athletic streak was often likened to a miracle that was difficult to explain logically. Such mathematical formulas could be realized in a real match and become successful. Because of its fantastic performance, Athletics was predicted to break the record for the most consecutive wins in American baseball history. They only needed to win one more match to get 20 consecutive wins and break the record. Amidst a flood of praise flowing profusely for Athletics, Beane's ex-wife also praised him for his achievement. Even though he was happy with his team's performance, Beane was still nervous, waiting for the result of the ongoing record-setting match. He was so tense and nervous. For the first time in years, Beane finally went to watch his team's match in person. It didn't take long until his trauma kicked in. Beane was so nervous and afraid that if he watched his team, they would lose and the record would fail. Finally, he left the stadium. The time continued until the evening. Athletics still led the score until the late game, but suddenly, their performance dropped drastically. The audience was surprised to see Athletics' performance that had suddenly declined. They were one step away from carving their historic record. The climax was when the opposing team managed to catch up and equalize the score. The commentator was excited to see Athletics struggling in the match. The commentators even predicted that the opposing team could win and destroy Athletics' opportunity to break the record. Beane couldn't do anything but sit in silence while watching his team's match on the television alone. Amid the crisis, Howe kept trying to find a way to turn things around, and finally, if previously he always refused to play Beane's recruited players, this time, he changed his mind by trying to let go of his ego and believed in Beane's Moneyball strategy. Howe appointed Happy as the batter. Everyone held their breath as Happy the home run. After 103 years since the American Baseball League started, Athletics managed to break a record that no team has ever achieved. After they managed to break the record for the most winning streaks in baseball history, the whole stadium screamed in euphoria. Happiness was seen everywhere, but strangely, Beane was not that happy about it. Beane was worried about their team's performance in the semi-final match later. His anxiety was not without reason, because the team indeed managed to set a record, but the league has not finished yet, meaning that if his team loses in the next game, they would immediately be eliminated, and last season's incident will happen again where his team failed to win the league. What's even more serious was that Beane had a hunch that he will be fired if Athletics failed to win the league that season. Long story short, the day of the decisive match finally came. Sadly, Athletics lost badly and were eliminated from the league. They failed to become the champions. After that loss, Beane felt very frustrated and anxious because his position as manager at the club was at stake. Luckily, what Beane worried about didn't happen, because it turned out that the owner of the club extended Beane's contract. The club owner trusted him to lead Athletics in the following season. Not long after that, Beane also received an offer from Boston Red Sox to manage the team. The club owner was ready to give a salary of $12.5 million to recruit him, a number so big that would make Beane the most expensive baseball manager in the world. Red Sox's club owner confessed that Beane's skill to manage the team and build a tough team with a mediocre budget was behind his interests. Beane even carved a record of 20 consecutive wins with such a team. The Red Sox's owner was also interested in the Moneyball strategy that Beane created, but after considering it, Beane decided to turn down the offer. Deep down, he loved Athletics. In the past, he once failed at that club as a player, but now, he was there as a manager. He was not going to stop until he succeeded in making Athletics the champion of the league. After a long discussion with Peter, whom he considered his close friend, Beane finally rejected the tempting offer from Red Sox and chose to stay loyal to Athletics. At the end of the film, Beane was seen driving his car somewhere while listening to a song composed by his daughter for her beloved father.